I am here with Dr. Tad Ruetenik, Professor of Philosophy, St. Amherst University. Tad, thanks so much for meeting with me today. I'd like to start things off if you can just explain exorcism, and then we can go from there.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. Most people, when they think of exorcism, they have a certain religious context in mind. What I like to think about in terms of exorcism is not just the question of if somebody has a demon. That's one question. And for example, a priest might come up with a way of determining a test to determine if someone has a demon. I like to consider what it is that we actually mean by demon. And a lot of people know this, I think, already, but it's always useful to remind people that the word demon is a really old term that just refers to a controlling spirit. So we've come to sort of give this these cartoonish evil qualities, and it could be that demons are very bad for people in some ways. But the original idea is that it's something that it's an outside force, something alien to the person that ultimately controls who they are. Socrates famously said he had a demon. That was his spirit that would tell him not to do certain things. So part of what I like to talk about, and I talk about in the books, The Demons of William James, is oftentimes people go to see mediums, which are supposed to be the transition in between two worlds. What's interesting about many of these mediums, and I know a lot of people probably have already had this experience or have seen things about this, these mediums often have what's known as a control. So it's a really interesting concept in that they don't sort of speak directly with the spirits. I mean, they're claiming to speak with the spirits, but they're not even claiming to speak directly with them. It's almost as if they have a handler of the afterlife, which is someone who kind of guides them or says, hey, this spirit's available or not available. And oftentimes this sort of control almost takes over the personality completely of the medium. So part of what I study is the philosopher William James, who was really known as a psychologist before he was a philosopher. Well, philosophy came before psychology. He was developing both of these things. But William James tried to investigate these mediums. And he had an interest in them in order not just to understand things about the other world, if it exists. He was pretty agnostic about that. But he saw it as extremely interesting for understanding the nature of human personality. How it is that we can have one personality that presents ourselves in our normal world. And in certain situations, we can have a different personality that presents itself. He took very seriously the idea of multiple personalities, but in a kind of a different sense than what we think about in terms of abnormal psychology. So this is what he was getting into when he was investigating mediums. And this is part of what is very much related to the idea of exorcism as well, because, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, the interesting part about these spirits that may take over people, it's that sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. And the real key is, if it's a demon in the bad sense, it needs to be expelled in some ways. And that can be done in any number of different ways. It could be just a psychological operation to people where people get rid of their bad habits, for example. So, and James and other people were considering the idea very seriously that there are other personalities, other groups of things that have certain characteristics that appear to be human, that sometimes can be part of people's minds and should be able to stay or maybe should be kicked out. So this is what he was working on. And this was kind of the idea of exorcism as well.
So what you're working on, if I understand you correctly, what you published in the book, the 2018 book that you wrote, is not investigating priests or religious clergy exercising or doing an exorcist to remove a controlling spirit from a person, but instead you're investigating the other kind of person that you might call, if it turns out someone has a controlling spirit, you're investigating the mediums. And these, I take it, are people that somehow say or actually do tap into another reality. And it turns out you have all these interesting theories about how we should understand these controlling spirits. And I think from what you said, we can conclude that just based on how you interpret what's going on, that might give you a conclusion. It sounded like you were saying, once you say it's a evil spirit controlling someone, that's begging for us to expel that evil spirit. And so there might be another way we might think of these controlling spirits that seem like the conclusion is not immediately, let's expel that spirit. But if you can have these two different, very different reactions to somebody being controlled, what does somebody's reaction to somebody looking like they're controlled tell you about them? What does that tell you about the person's personality?
Well, this is the thing that William James took a lot of heat for throughout his career of investigating, because he was a friendly investigator of these mediums. So there are many skeptics
criticizing them, or what does that mean, friendly?
Well, friendly means that he was trying to bring out the phenomena as much as possible. Okay, I think, one of the examples would be like if we're doing teaching or something, and what's one way to teach is to ask all these direct questions and put students on the spot, and then see if they survive, and that often shuts people down, right? Or as you can teacher, what you can do is try to draw things out, take what they actually believe and see where it leads. And then that often opens people up, right? And then they start to understand things better. Well, science can be done different ways. There is that very critical thing that's saying, look, you're going to have to really prove to me that this is real, and we're going to try everything that we can to shut this down, and you have to make it happen anyways. Or we can say, look, we're going to try to provide the conditions most favorable for the phenomenon to manifest itself, and then we will see from there. And then he took sort of that route. But the problem with that is that it leaves you very open to fraud. And it's not just a fraud of mediums that are doing intentional trickery. That was certainly the case. But it's almost, James refers to this sometimes, it's almost like the fraud of the whole universe. That's just sometimes the way things are, they present themselves to weird ways, and we make very bad conclusions based off of that. So the reaction of the person is part of it as well. I will give you, if you don't mind, I'll give you a story from James. Yeah. He worked in the early days of science, this is turn of the century type of stuff. And I guess he was a TA for someone at some point. And they had this experiment where you took a frog, you put it on the table, and they were showing how electricity actually moves the muscles. It's early Frankenstein type of stuff, So he's there, and the other professor is talking about this, saying, hey, look, this is what we could do with muscles. And there's this presumably large group of presumably male scientists who you can picture with their, those little eye things, whatever those are called.
Monocles, I think.
Yeah. Looking at them very skeptically. And this was a frog's heart, I should say. And they had it all hooked up here. Well, apparently, the nature of all material things is to decay after a while. So this particular frog's heart was just too far gone. It was just calcified. It wasn't going to happen. So here he is in this situation where all these people are looking, and the prof says, okay, here's what happens when you put the energy on it, and nothing happened. It wasn't going to work for him. And then James says something really remarkable. He says, instinctively at that moment, what I did is I took my finger underneath it and moved it the way it should have been moving. Okay. Now, was that fraud? Was that trickery on his part? Because he knew what normally happened. I mean, that was true. It just wasn't happening right there. He wanted to present the case for all the people to show what really happened. So instinctively, he just made that sort of happen. This is the interesting thing about when James was talking with mediums, because, you know, he wasn't naive in that he accepted everything. He realized that most of the mediums out there, you know, most of it was bullshit. We didn't ask if we could swear in these, did we?
Try not to.
Okay, all right. We can edit that out if we need to. James wanted to, he didn't believe all of these mediums were right. And in fact, most of them were either fraudulent or just hacks. But sometimes there were mediums that would do remarkable things, you know, say things that it's, you know, almost impossible they could have known, especially in a time before the internet and everything, right? And so he looked at some of these mediums and found that there was some good stuff. Now, the ones that did do good things sometimes, when put on the spot and the stuff didn't work out would cheat in various ways.
Oh, I see.
It's like magicians. They call those outs. Magicians have outs. If they do some kind of a trick and it fails, they have some kind of thing where they can divert attention. And so there was that kind of form of trickery that was going on. William James, by the way, did find Leonora Piper. And anyone who's interested can look her up. He considers her the one true case. He spent years studying her, and fairly controlled studies in that they hired a private investigator to see where she was going around, and they were very careful about the information that would enter the room. But the only thing he really did conclude about her is that whatever she was doing, she was sincere about it. So if this was a controlling personality, this personality was not consciously fabricated by her. They did some weird tests with her too, by the way. They would I think they'd prick her skin to see if she was in a trance, or put bleach on her tongue, all sorts of horrible, turn of the century science kind of stuff you couldn't get away with doing probably nowadays without going through some committee at the university.
Who would probably say not to do that.
Yeah, they would probably say, yeah, but so he got away with all that. But
so you're telling us that William James, an academic, a rigorous intellectual, doing some serious scientific psychology with good philosophical methods, concluded that at least Leonora Piper, at least one individual out of all the individuals he looked at, was somehow tapping into a different reality and bringing back messages sincerely, or something was going on there.
Yeah, and it could be other ways too. You don't necessarily have to take the assumption that there's another world here, but that there is something very extraordinary about the human mind.
Okay. Can you tell us more about that? I mean, it sounds like that was in the background the whole time. Right. Socrates, a person, is telling us that there is another spirit inside of him telling him what not to do or what not to say. And it sounds like we're not talking about what I would have in mind when I think of split personality disorder. It sounds like there's something else going on. So can you try to help me understand, what is it about personality that has us assume there's one spirit, such that there might be two spirits sometimes? What am I missing here? What is it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, when we think of souls, often if you go back to Plato talks about sort of the soul as kind of this, I guess we would call an atom, a metaphysical atom, this thing that can't be created nor destroyed. Okay. James considers that idea in his psychology book and says, that's a great idea, but who would want to live like that? I mean, you're just a little bubble in the universe, right? So there's no content to that idea of a soul. A personality, and when I think of personality, I don't think of this little like object. I think of just a group of a bunch of characteristics, of a bunch of habits, ultimately. So how you know anybody is based on the habits that they present to you, these regularities in their behavior. And if they change their habits dramatically, it makes perfect sense to say that they are a different person in that sense.
So what's the difference I mean, it's okay if you don't have a theory on everything ever, but
Yeah.
what's the difference between some person who is, I don't know if androgynous is the right word, but has, like, let's say, really extroverted personality traits and very introverted personality traits, and that's one person, versus what I think you might have in mind when you're talking about a demon inside of another person, because it sounded like you were defining demon as just controlled by another spirit, but how can you tell when there's a demon controlling a spirit inside of a spirit versus someone who's just super extroverted and super introverted, but that's their one personality?
Oh, right. Well, I guess one of the things we could talk about with James is he does really talk about different personalities in terms of the different ways we present ourselves. And it's, in a way, it's a very ordinary concept, but the person you're at when you're a student in college, for example, the way you present yourself to your instructor during class time.
Prompt, caring, studious.
Right. Don't swear in class, all of that stuff. Yeah, right. And you sit up, whatever. And then, when you go back to the dorm room and then you do other things, and then that's a different self.
Yelling, smoking, chewing.
Right. Yeah. And then there's a whole different one that goes with your parents, right? So your parents, you present a different side to them as well. And then your priest and pastor. And there's a different sets of habits. There's different ways of talking. Those might not be all that different. There might be a lot of overlap in things that happen there. But those, social selves in a important way are real selves. So now what happens, it sounds like what you're asking is what happens when you get like this controlling spirit and somehow maybe the energy of one of these groups of habits really gets tied together very much. So it just seems like an entirely different person. And this is what would happen with Leonora Piper. She would become this Frenchman as one of her controls, and he would, Dr. Finu, I can't pronounce it exactly in French, but they looked him up. They couldn't find this guy, any record of him anywhere. I guess he didn't really have internet back then, of course, but I mean, they did their thing and went over and they couldn't find any record of him, but this guy was talking through her in a French accent. Well, James lived overseas, so his superpower was to speak very good French, and so he would talk with the spirit, in French. And it turned out that the guy only used stock French phrases. It was not, his skills were not very good in French. So it made them a little skeptical that something else was going on. But I mean, this was like a Boston housewife who was acting out, but if she was acting out, she was an extraordinary actor in doing this personality. And plus, remember, she was unconscious while this was happening. So and I know folks who've done acting, this is probably pretty normal to them to have a controlling spirit. I guess that's what acting is, right? The true actors really sort of channel a character, and that character might not have existed really before, but then it gets created in a certain context, and it has effects that seem very real.
But somehow he still thought she was sincere. So that obviously didn't rule out for him that there's something legitimately going on with her serving as a real medium. So
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit more about, if if it's okay, I'm going to kind of change the topic here. You seem to have a pretty clear idea of, I don't know if the right way is to put it, hierarchy of demons or a demonology, a theory of what it is to be a demon, and like the outskirts of that, what gets counted as a demon versus not. And maybe that has something to do with what counts as exorcism versus not. But I invite you to tell us more about the theory of demons.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of distinguish the two different types. There are types that have like names, and then types whose names are sort of symbols.
Okay.
So like, you give a demon, and there's actually psychologists will do this, like, this is your demon is lust or something. We're going to give that the name lust. Now, from a psychological perspective, that's like, creating it as an object. And once you create something as an object, it's much easier to, I guess, expel it in some ways.
I see. So
Um,
what about the other type? Not the type that we're just naming so we can deal with it, but the kind that, what's that other one?
they have proper names.
Oh, okay, like an actual personality of a demon.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they don't go by their function. So there's like, yeah, that was functional demonology, where their name is their function. But the other part of that is like a proper name. And if you think about the nature of language, if you take a proper name, it doesn't really have a reference to anything. It just belongs to that one particular thing. And yeah, and some of the names were, I don't have any of them with me, but they create names here that maybe it was consciously created by someone, I don't know, but they are named in a way that would indicate a human being and not just a function.
So what's the difference between someone who thinks that they might have a spirit inside of them that's not their own, and wants to figure out what that spirit's doing and how to get rid of it, or how not to get rid of it, maybe how to keep it? What's the difference between that person and the person who thinks, I'm crazy, I lost my mind, this is just a pigment of my imagination, nothing is real, this isn't real, as opposed to the first guy who's thinking, oh wow, there's a spirit inside of me, what's their name, what do they want? Like, what's the difference between those kinds of people?
Oh, yeah, I don't know if I have the answer to that. You mentioned earlier multiple personality disorder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the key word there is the disorder part. It only becomes a thing, it becomes a pathology when it's somehow overall there's poor functioning. The person doesn't function well in the world, it causes them anxiety or something. But normally, if there is sort of different personalities, and remember, I'm talking about that in a very general sense of different types of habits. If we have that, I mean, it's quite functional. Like personally with me, I mean, I don't have any, particularly strong, unfortunately, I don't have any particularly strong like paranormal experiences to talk about, but, lately I've been getting involved. I used to be a musician for years, and before I decided to become a superstar philosopher, I wanted to be a superstar heavy metal guitarist, and so that my world was focused on that, and so lately, my wife decided, hey, let's do a TikTok. I'm like, that's stupid. So then I got involved with TikTok and doing these little videos. Okay. And it sucked me in such a way that, and I would do this and I start writing these songs and writing these little 1-minute things and putting together these videos and sort of feeling that musical thing and being that same kind of person that I was before. And it's a little bit of a disruption then to go back to my philosophy self. And that's why I always told my wife for years, I don't want to get back into music. She'd be, oh, you should get back into it. No, you would lose me. All right. Of course I was kidding, but there is that part of people that gets into that old self. And this applies in very real ways to two types of people that many are probably thinking of right now. One would be people with alcohol or drug problems. Their old user self is a different personality that they've moved past. And then other people, when talking about gender dysmorphia or something like that, or gender issues, if they transition or something, that might be an old self and a new self and all of that. Or you can have the various kind of selves that are. So I know one of the things that James was doing with his psychology is he was queering psychology long before we do it now. People were doing it nowadays, but in a different sense, not so much in terms of gender, but just in the very nature of personality, making it much more, for better or worse, much more fluid. He often did say that we did, or not often, I think there was one point where he talks about multiple personalities and that the one we have, it just happens to be the strongest among all the others. So it's really a relative thing, and maintaining that tension or maintaining that control in that tense situation is the key.
So is sometimes exorcism silencing or muffling the strong personality or spirit inside of you to give way for another spirit or personality inside of you, something like that? So okay, so what would be your or James's reaction to someone going around the internet saying, hire me, I do exorcisms, I'll come and get your loudest spirit or your controlling spirit out of you? What would be your reaction to see that kind of sales pitch? Like, hey, do you have a controlling spirit you don't like? Call me, I'll get rid of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the definitions of pragmatism, which is what James was kind of known for.
What is that?
Yeah, pragmatism is, it's really hard. I've studied it for years and it's really hard. I'm going to start, I'm almost, it's unfortunate I use names sometimes because it's difficult to explain, but it's sort of the idea that truth is always presented within our actions. And, whether our actions work in the world, not just for our own personal interest, but, whether we're functioning well in the world. And so the question would be, if you can do that, then let's see if they have great results. There's one book that I do use. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called How to Think About Weird Things. It's a critical thinking textbook. Oh, it's Schick and Vaughn, I think, are the authors. And they do a lot of paranormal stuff using critical thinking. And they're very skeptical they're fairly skeptical of paranormal stuff, which is good. They do, I think, make one sort of error that I've sort of pointed out before. They say that when you're talking with mediums, they might get paid just as much as a traditional psychoanalyst for doing the work, right? And they see that as somehow an injustice because a psychoanalyst is doing the real stuff and then the mediums or the psychics are doing different stuff. On one level, that's probably true. I mean, there's a certain fidelity to the facts that traditional psychology has that mediums might not. But I don't know. I just have to say, when people are going to mediums, if they feel better, if they overcome grief through the mediums more than they would from a traditional psychotherapist, isn't that okay? Right.
So there's your pragmatism.
Yeah, and that's why I'm reluctant to use that word, because then, in the philosophical context, for people that study logic and everything, it just sounds like pragmatism just makes excuses for everything. But I think in this limited context, I think this is what James was talking about. He was a psychologist, just like Freud was a psychologist, and their fundamental job was to help people. I mean, we often think of like philosophers as going after the truth, and the truth usually works for making people's lives better. But making lives better is ultimately what we're after here. So again, James was sort of really, I had to get into in the book here, get into all sorts of stuff with exorcisms. There's a little chapter on alien abduction phenomenon, because if you want to think about it, that is sort of a new technological version of the old demonology. There's still these things that are either good or bad, like spirits, or, well, alien. The word alien ultimately just means outside of you.
Outside, external, yeah.
External, right. And alienist was the old term, I think, used in France for psychologists. I think that was it. But so that there's something outside of your control, ultimately. So I get into all of that, and there's again, an idea about how alien abduction phenomenon can be understood in light of what James is talking about.
As an analogy, maybe alien abduction as an analogy to a demon abducting your body.
Which is the analog, which is which is the real, which is the other one,
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could say demons are analogy for the ultimate idea of aliens. But again, the real functional idea is, why are these people feel out of control in their lives? And I will mention one more thing you said about these personalities, and that people might have strong personalities.
Yeah.
Mediums, when they were channeling this control, it was often kind of a rude sort of a person, that would say things that were a little socially unacceptable. Now, especially interesting, considering that James was dealing with bourgeoisie Boston women that would go to the mediums, right? So there is a theory that says a lot of this mediumship is, it's many times from women. It's focused on women, and it's sort of a way to be more assertive in a world in which they can't be as assertive. So there's an alternative personality that kind of comes out. I don't know how well that theory stands out over time, whether, you can explain everything that way, but yeah.
Very good.